Perfect.
Please go ahead.
Welcome everyone to the next session. I'm going to introduce Ellis Ballard, and the title of his talk is on the screen. Ellis is a director of the Social System Design Lab and assistant professor of practice at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. His research and teaching focus is on advancing participatory approaches to system dynamics modeling with communities to advance health access and social justice. As a researcher and consultant, he works with community organizations, foundations, development banks, research teams, and corporations to build capabilities to develop system dynamics models. So clearly has a wealth of different backgrounds to draw on and bring to us today. Without further ado, go ahead, Ellis.
Great, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be presenting at this conference. I think the pragmatic focus of this conference really resonates with my work and my values at Washington University in St. Louis. What I do in my sort of incentives and roles is really to think about how might we use system dynamics modeling and systems mapping tools to support and amplify the practice of social work and in public health and social policy, which are the professional schools where I teach. And so this is an ongoing question about how can this be useful? How do we advance these methods? And so what I want to talk about is some ideas about why might you want to involve real live people outside of your laboratory in modeling and mapping work. And then just to give a couple of recommendations for approaches and tools to start doing that. And I am greatly benefit from following Dr. Kenzie and Dr. Hassmiller-Litch, who have presented before me, who have motivated ideas of complexity. So I don't have to, which is wonderful. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about causal mapping, system modeling, and structural data, just to sort of ground ourselves. Then talk about participation in map and model development, and then provide one example of a very recent sort of ongoing project about the double burden of malnutrition in Peru. That's very, I was just back from Peru a couple weeks ago for group model building work. Then talk about a couple of tools for group model building design and close with opportunities to learn further. And I welcome folks to add notes in the chat or questions. I'll either adjust as I go or we'll have time at the end to talk. So starting out, this idea of causal mapping and system modeling and structural data. We've had multiple arguments for why we might do system mapping or system modeling, and I'll use a different visualization from my colleague Laura Guzman Abello at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. She's a system dynamicist that I work with closely. But she thinks about how do we understand the broader system interconnections that generate problematic system behaviors that matter to individuals, to matter to our own experiences. And if we think about system structure, we can think about that individual embedded in social and community structures that are embedded within neighborhood, regional environments, which are embedded within institutional systems, which are embedded within bureaucratic and commercial systems, which are embedded within histories of science and policy. And I think this is a really nice way to visualize both the importance of systems concepts as well as the complexity of actually trying to wrap your head around this. And as folks have previously talked about, and I won't talk much more, that we have a wealth of systems tools, maps, and models to do this work. My grounding is in system dynamics modeling, and so that's what I'll be talking about. But we can think about qualitative mapping and sort of as a hand-drawn process, or more formal qualitative mapping and modeling, as was just discussed. We can think about simulation modeling, conceptual modeling, and learning interfaces like this work around health system responses to malaria, or more formal theory development modeling. And this is a work about artificial intelligence generated treatment algorithms. But undergirding this mapping and modeling work is the need for a different type of data than often we are familiar with or comfortable with. In system dynamics and systems modeling, John Sterman talks about the need for structural data to inform our system models. And often we're comfortable with this idea of the physics of the system. What are the components? What are their interactions? But the two elements that are harder to come by and perhaps more challenging are information about information cues. Who has what information about which at what time? How are those information delayed, biased, misperceived, right? That's a really integral part of when we're talking about system behavior and system structure. And then the third element is decision rules. How do actors in these systems make decisions on the basis of those information that come to them? What are the decision processes? What are the thresholds and criteria? What are the policies and goals that they're being optimized on? And so just as previous presentations talked about, a lot of the valuable data and the contribution of systems approaches is looking at the in-between spaces, the interstitial, informal, or intangible system factors that can explain why we have these unintended consequences or these counterintuitive system behaviors. I'd argue a lot of that comes from the complex interaction of information cues and decision rules. And one of the challenges then, if we're trying to build maps and models, not just of what are the tangible, countable, observable components of a system, but how are actors making decisions, is that data of structural data doesn't often exist in conventional data sources. And so Jay Forrester, from the beginning, who's sort of the grandfather of system dynamics, talked about relative sources of structural data for system dynamics modeling. He talked about how the numeric database, which can be used for identifying trends over time for calibration, for quantifications of the state of a system at a point in time, effect sizes of causal influence, that's just a small subset of overall data that we might be building from. The written database, qualitative work, qualitative literature, journalism, reports, organizational records, board notes, case notes, right? This is a broader range of structural data about how people actually make decisions, how people have made decisions in the past, what are policies that folks work with. But the richest source that Forrester talked about is the mental database, the database of knowledge from experience and decision-making of people who work in real systems that exist in their heads about how do we understand the world working. That's this sort of massive untapped source of knowledge and insight in understanding system structure and system behavior. And the challenge then, if we want to be accessing the mental database and moving, supplementing or moving beyond our customed numeric databases, is how do we access that? And I like to think about this challenge through the well-worn parable of the blindfolded men and the elephant, who approach this elephant and are all asked to describe what is this thing that's before you. And each person holding on to a different part of the elephant describes in detail and precision and accuracy from their own experience what is an elephant, but they have completely different stories. And that, if we think about these complex systems, these maps and models that are representations of the real world, we think about these complex systems as elephants. We all are these blindfolded folks. We all have accurate but bounded, contextually driven, socially constructed perceptions of reality. And so we can't rely on one alone. And so the challenge that we want to work with is saying, okay, if we think we need to be engaging with this structural data, and that structural data is incomplete, flawed, contextually driven, and bounded, how the heck do we proceed? And so what I want to talk about is a specific set of practices around participatory model development and causal mapping. So group model building, a lot of definitions, but this is what I like to use, describes a participatory process for using system dynamics modeling to engage those affected by policy or program change, to define problems from a systems or a feedback perspective, to formulate qualitative and quantitative models, to analyze potential leverage of policy decisions and potential unintended consequences in order to make decisions on how best to act. And this is a series of photos of group model building work from a workshop in Brazil now a couple of years ago for sort of preliminary research team collaborations with the Sol or Ball collaboration that's hosted by a network of folks at Drexel University. And when we think about group model building, we can think about it as serving multiple functions. We can think about group model building as an intervention approach, an approach to building capabilities and systemic thinking within communities and groups, for building language or consensus, for negotiating conflict or conceptualizing system redesign. At the same time, we can think about it as a research method for describing a system that might be creating problematic behaviors, for learning about differences in stakeholder mental models, for theory development, for comparative scenario testing or policy analysis. We can also think about it as a system science research method that's interested in identifying generalizable system insights for advancing the methods of how you might even use these tools writ large, right? And I like to highlight this because I think there's often this conflation that we're thinking about group model building only as an intervention approach, or only as a research method, or only as a system science research method, and not making this discernment about where are we overlapping? To what extent are we achieving multiple goals? And to what extent do our designs and our approaches need to reflect that fact? So in a group model building process, there's sort of a generalized sequence. And sort of, in fact, how this works, not necessarily prescriptively. But we can think about a generalized sequence of group model building activities over time, where we have some sort of problem definition, some sort of generation of the components, the physics of the system, and then starting to say, how are those interconnected? What is that structure? How do those combine to create some sort of a larger whole? Then think about refinement, iteration, improvement of that model, and use that result for analysis and prioritization of insight. And so we can think about examples of this as negotiation of a trend over time about what has been historical, what is the problem of interest, what has been the historical behavior, what are our future hopes and fears. That's what's represented here. We can think about variable elicitation exercises to elicit what are the factors relevant to this problem. We can think about structural elicitation to think about what are the causal loop diagramming, how might we use the tools of causal loop diagrams to develop feedback theories of how these factors are interconnected. We can think about refining and building a more formal model like a stock and flow diagram. And we can think about using that as a basis for eliciting action ideas. And so, like I said, this is a sort of a stylized or a generalized sequence that builds on sort of traditions in group model building. But the actual way you might go about that may vary widely depending on community and system context. And so you might think about variable elicitation exercises as having variations where what you're doing is eliciting behavior over time graphs rather than just factors, because you really want to highlight this idea of dynamic change. You may think about virtual formats for doing group model building work there. You may think about more participatory rural appraisal informed trend analysis to understand factors, how they have changed in more of a tactile, tangible approach. In terms of structural elicitation, we might think about causal loop diagramming that's broken out into small groups where you have folks who are problem solving or negotiating together without an expert modeler who's actively facilitating that model development. We might think about connection circles, which is a more scaffolded or simplified version that's less worried about feedback and more focused on interconnections. Again, we might think about virtual alternatives to in-person hands-on activities, or we might disperse with words altogether and think about symbolic representations and building maps and models that are using images in situations where you have folks who have varying levels of literacy or speak vastly different languages or dialects. Right? And so all of these are contextual decisions that are informed by the desire to build and maintain models as boundary objects. And a boundary object in sociological literature is the idea of a commonly constructed and developed visual representation that serves as a bridge between multiple life experiences, perspectives, disciplinary languages, and mental models. And we're really saying, how are we creating these models so that they are reflective of the experiences of the people who are living in these systems? And we have to think about the processes of designing participatory modeling work as a process of prioritizing this maintenance of a model as this boundary object, as this tool that's a bridge between people's perspectives. And so I'm going to give an example from some recent work about how we negotiated some of these contextual decisions. And so this is from a research project that's ongoing, funded by the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council in the UK. It's a collaboration from the Crónica Center in Lima, Peru, Imperial College London, folks at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and us at the Social System Design Lab at Washington University in St. Louis. And we're really interested in this phenomenon of the double burden of malnutrition, the interconnection or co-occurrence of non-communicable diseases and outcomes associated with overweight and obesity with this in the same population, sometimes in the same families, still relevant patterns of undernutrition and stunting within children. And so the question is thinking, how are we understanding these two problematic behaviors as a function of a policy system operating over time? How do we understand how families make decisions, how policymakers make decisions, how food outlet actors make decisions in this sort of complex and evolving system? And so our modeling project, which is ongoing, has really focused on this interactive process between broader community stakeholder input and then a smaller research team to try to conceptualize this idea of the double burden from a feedback perspective that's embedded or grounded in community perspectives and voices in order to identify and test policies over time. And so some of the decisions that we're negotiating in the design of our community sessions is participation. Who is even involved? How are those people working together or separated based on power dynamics, based on relative experiences, common experiences or different experiences? How are we sequencing our work, both in order to have outputs from some activities feed as inputs into the next, as well as to interface with the larger research cycle? How are we thinking about the plausible mediums or formats for this work? In a world where COVID is still very much a reality, where research team is distributed across the world, and where there's a lot of uncertainty about if and how people can connect online as well as in person. And so where we've landed with this is thinking about eliciting understanding of these multiple system interconnections from folks in 2 regions of Peru, and think in Iquitos, in the Amazon, as well as in Lima, and thinking about multiple stakeholder perspectives. And in the design of this work, in Lima, thinking about both for pragmatic purposes of scheduling and transport, given the traffic in Lima, but also the sort of nature of collaboration within the ecosystem of folks working on nutrition and policy change, thinking about parallel processes where we run sequences of workshops with NGO representatives, with policymakers, with food system stakeholders, community stakeholders, as a process that happens in parallel, and then only bring people together to critique and refine. And so this is some images from some parent workshop sessions using connection circles to start to elicit those causal structures. And then in Iquitos, where there's a much more coherent and localized community of folks who are working on these issues, thinking about this as a multi-session, long, intensive collective workshop, where we're running these same activities together, where that's being iterated upon with the same group of people at one point in time. And here's some images of some tangible or large group connection circle activities and some graphs over time scripts. And so I show these because as we think about what does it mean to engage with people in this process, one of the things I really want to highlight is the value in thinking about traditional sequences or sequences that have been read about or have been published on or have been documented as a foundation for a design process about what does group model building work look like. So I'm going to want to propose a handful of tools that I think are valuable for actually trying to put the stuff up on its feet. So the first is, I'm going to go in a different order actually than this. The first is the idea of a core modeling team. This is something that's vastly underappreciated in terms of actually putting participatory modeling work up on its feet. This is thinking about a design team of 3 to 6 people who are responsible for the design of workshops who are not only representative of research perspectives. So I think about this as a team that brings together substantive or research ideas, methods perspectives about system dynamics modeling, group model building, facilitation, logistical perspectives about how do people work together, what is necessary in order to actually create these kinds of convenings, and then community perspectives. What are the power dynamics? What are the uses of language? What are prior or parallel community efforts that are happening where a research project is embedded? And so thinking about this from the jump, from the very beginning of a modeling project, to identify and convene folks who don't all have research orientation in the design of this work, people who carry forth design as an active process of modeling work rather than something that happens in proposal development and then is just implemented later. And so thinking about core modeling team as something that's designed for, convened, and facilitated over time. The second is a idea of group model building scripts. This is a resource that has been sort of developed and continues to evolve within the system dynamics community. These are actually scripted activities that can be developed, adapted, and built on to combine to create group model building workshops. To know that there is a body of work that can be drawn from that doesn't require everybody making all this up for themselves the first time. And practice that I like to really work on is thinking about how do you actually have scripts as if this was a play, as if this was a film script for the facilitation of activities so that it is highly structured and therefore accessible and a valuable experience for people who are actually engaging in this work. The third tool that I would propose is a project design matrix. This is a tool for making explicit what are our design criteria for the evaluation of these workshops. And the design of these tools is really thinking about what are the criteria that we're using to make a decision about how we are designing workshops, around ease of participation, around likelihood of ending on a coherent model or not, around broadness of perspectives versus going deeper with a narrow group of people. So really thinking about making explicit those criteria, and then highlighting what are 3 to 4 different workshop designs that we could consider to achieve this aim. Really thinking about this as something where you are balancing multiple approaches and proceeding with the actual formal design of these workshops beyond just initial thought. And so a design matrix is a tool to represent, to negotiate this type of planning. And the final tool that I would recommend is piloting. One of the traps that I have fallen into, and I think a lot of research-oriented folks can fall into, is this idea that says the only modeling work that matters is when we pull people together. We want to extract or welcome folks to bring their insights to this modeling workshop. But don't take this time to use a term, eat their own dog food, to eat the product, to try out the product that they are developing, try out the process that they are developing and asking other folks to engage in. And so I really encourage folks to think about small scale pilots where you use yourselves as a community to test run scripts, activities, to say what comes out if we were be asked these questions, as a way to test the feasibility, the logic of scripts, as well as to develop preliminary insights. And so what I'll close with, and then I would love to chat some more, is some resources that I want to point you to. This is something that I care deeply about, and I'm trying to fit into 20 minutes. So there's way, way, way more that can be talked about. But I'd encourage you to think about the Scriptopedia, which I mentioned. This is a great resource. It's flawed, it's evolving, it's due for an upgrade, but a really great collection of group model building activities from a wide range of practice contexts. Second resource is this community of folks who surround the Social System Design Lab. This is practitioners, researchers, teachers, students who are explicitly invested in this work. And I name this group because I think there's a lot of practitioners, people who are doing applied work in public health agencies, community organizations, who have training in system dynamics and group model building, who can be engaged, hired, contracted with, that don't have to be researchers. And I think that's an amazing asset. And then the final one I'll recommend is that there's a lot of learning resources out there if you're interested in going deeper. These are 3 happening this summer. The International System Dynamics Conference this year is in Germany, but they have an online summer school in early July. That is a really amazing resource to learn about system dynamics modeling. There's a summer institute that we're hosting around group model building, system dynamics, agent-based modeling, systems thinking, and social network analysis here in St. Louis. And the folks at Michigan State are hosting participatory modeling field school, which is a really awesome opportunity to dive deeper into this work as well. So I blaze through, but I would love to engage with questions, comments, ideas, etc., if there's time.
Excellent talk, Ellis. Thank you so much. Give you some applause here from all of us. There are a few questions in the chat, and we do have 6 minutes, it looks like, for questions here. I will look at helping you sift through those, but I see one here from Dr. Broadus. Can you describe your process for synthesizing, establishing coherence across the results that emerge across workshop groups, particularly parallel workshops?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there's a couple of different ways that I think about this. One is to think about standardized scripts, facilitation manuals that can be replicated over and over again. That intentional design and piloting on the front end can be invaluable in in thinking about what are those convergences and coherence over time. The second thing I think about is the use of either concept models, simple simulations that set up a specific problem domain or dynamic and really link that structure and behavior relationship as a orienting tool that can be used as maybe a seed structure that folks are reacting to. So rather than designing a workshop where you say, what are the factors? And then it can go anywhere depending on who's based in the room, really thinking about actually grounding folks in a common structure where folks are thinking about specific, a specific continuum of care, for instance. That's some work I've done around smoking cessation pharmacology prescriptions, specific continuum of care that folks are thinking about what are the factors affecting these transitions so that there is a common structure that can be returned to. And then finally, thinking about a sort of a formal and a documented process of synthesis where there is a mix of an art and science about synthesizing across multiple sessions. And inevitably, if you're using different stakeholder groups, there's going to be variations and differences. But I think that that's a really healthy thing to be wrestling with, asking yourself, to what extent are these artifacts of our design choices versus real functions of different perspectives of system structure. I think there's a lot more that can be said about that.
Great, a question here in the room.
Thank you for your talk today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So my name is Michelle Rousey, and I have a question about the mental databases that you were mentioning earlier. And in thinking about this with human behavior, a lot of what we do is unconscious. So I'm curious about how you're able to pull out some of those unconscious behaviors that we don't necessarily recognize as being part of our systems and our processes. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. And I think that that's an area for a whole lot of additional work, right? So I think that there's some of it is about structuring workshops that aren't asking people about their own behavior, but asking people about how do people like you or how do people in your community make decisions. So it's asking folks to interpret or make sense of other folks' motivations, right? Another piece of it is thinking about triangulation, right? We're not thinking about this accessing the mental database through participatory processes as a substitute for comparing against empirical data, et cetera. But thinking about something that complements, that highlights where there may be conflicts or disagreements. And then the third area, and this is actually some of the folks at Michigan State that are doing some really interesting work around this, is thinking about creating opportunities for experiential games, sort of controlled experiments about how people might make decisions or discernment among multiple choices when given specific information cues. There's tools that you can do that with online model simulations where people are making decisions about what to do next given an information cue, and you can start to derive information from that. But you could also create sort of games or real life scenarios to start to study that as well. And so I say there's a lot of room to do this because I think this is this interconnection of different traditions of research and practice is really ripe for experimentation and sharing tools. But I think that's a really important sort of consideration.
Excellent. We are coming up to time. I have maybe one last thing. I don't know, Ellis, if you have a last word to share with us, any other final reflections?
Yeah, I think, I welcome folks to reach out. I think this is an area where I can say from being in this world for a while now, there is a drastic under documentation and under sharing about the processes through which we may formulate models, the processes of engaging with folks to inform the kind of systemic analysis that my colleagues have talked about. And the more we can think about that as something that's explicitly designed, managed, improved upon, shared, and critiqued, I think that's going to strengthen science. It's going to strengthen the translation to practice, and I think just do more ethical, equitable work when we're putting the spotlight on these processes. So I really invite folks to engage with that work. And I'm happy to put my email in the chat. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff because I nerd out on it. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Ellis. Really appreciate that. Appreciate your time. So as complete the recording there, and as Jordan has just put in the chat, at 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time in 15 minutes, we'll have the best of CopperCon. So the 5 best abstract submissions will be presented in a lightning 5-minute presentation each, with Dr. Perez Hollis moderating that. So 15-minute break until then. Thank you, everyone.